Alright, so this is a GPU that a lot of you have been waiting for. This is AMD's new RX 5500 XT that launches today, priced between $170 and $200 US. We'll talk about that in a moment, and right in time for the holiday season. Now at that price, performance is going to be seriously interesting because it's going up against so many already great value options. Actually, it does feel like forever since AMD launched a GPU in this price range that wasn't just a refresh of something else. So the 5500 XT is a highly anticipated GPU, and if the 5700 XT was anything to go off, performance here should be really impressive. So let's not waste any more time, let's take a quick look at the specs and then see how this thing performs in games. One thing that I'll mention right off the bat is that the 5500 XT will be available in both an 8GB model and a lower priced 4GB model that has a base MSRP of $169 US. Thankfully, there's no trickery or sneaky tactics going on between these two models like we've seen before. Both the 4GB and 8GB 5500 XTs will have the same number of compute units and otherwise processing power. It's just the video memory capacity that will be different. So if bumping up your in-game textures to Ultra in demanding titles is something that you are after, the 8GB model is likely a good idea, but if you play mostly mainstream or esports titles with moderate to high-ish textures, then the 4GB model will offer the better value. Here's a quick look at what we're working with. The 5500 XT has 22 compute units compared to the 36 and 40 on the 5700 and 5700 XT respectively, so quite a significant cut. That's fair enough though, given the also massive cut in price. The 5500 XT also gets a narrower memory interface in comparison, but still thankfully fast GDDR6. In fact, Nvidia didn't want to miss out on this GDDR6 memory party, so they invited themselves with the recent GTX 1650 Super and 1660 Super GPUs. Both are considered competitors to the 5500 XT. The 1650 Super, unfortunately, we do not have on hand for testing just yet. Also worth noting, as far as I know, AMD are not producing their own reference cooler design like they have with the 5700 and 5700 XT, so your choice will be limited to add-in board partner cards only. Now the one that I've got here is MSI's Gaming X, and as usual they have sampled me with the more premium model despite this being a budget oriented card, and as usual you can expect to pay a premium for a cooler design like this. Given that the 5500 XT only has a 130 watt TDP though, I'd say you're going to be more than fine with one of the more affordable models out there with a more conservative cooler design. In terms of thermal performance, the Gaming X topped out at 74 degrees C on the GPU, 84 C for the hotspot, and 76 degrees C for the memory hotspot. This was with the fan speed set to auto on an open test bench with a 22C room ambient. Overall, acceptable thermals with a fairly conservative and near silent fan speed. Alright, now let's jump into the gaming benchmarks, and starting with Far Cry 5, we're seeing overall some pretty decent gaming performance. Again, we are looking at the $200 8GB model today, but given that it's just a video memory capacity difference between this and the 4GB model, the numbers should be very, very close where VRAM isn't maxed out. Here, the 5500 XT is a little over 5% faster than the RX 590. In Overwatch, the margin is a bit closer between those two cards, and for reference, the RX 590 can currently be bought for around $200 even. So really, these performance numbers are looking okay so far for the 5500 XT. Rainbow Six Siege played decently for the new AMD card with strong lowest 1% of FPS performance and averages about on par with the RX 590. Apex Legends showed promising performance for the 5500 XT, again specifically when it comes to the overall stability of the frame rate in game. Here we're 7.8% faster than the RX 590 on average and within 6% of the GTX 1660. And a similar story in Doom running the Vulkan API within just a few percent of the $220 GTX 1660. In comparison to the 1660 Super in this title, you'll need to spend an additional $30 to $60 for a boost of around 11% over the 5500 XT. Again, the 4GB model should perform very similarly in most titles. Now in comparison to the previous budget Radeon cards running on the Polaris architecture, performance is quite strong overall. In Project Cars 2, we're 24% faster than the RX 570, 12% faster than the RX 580, and 5% faster than the RX 590. One thing that I'll mention is that it's quite hard to outright recommend a card between one of the better value performers here, because in some cases we are just talking about a price difference of around $20. We'll compare overall value directly in just a minute though. Fortnite Chapter 2 showed very consistent results with what we've seen up until this point, a slight performance boost over the RX 590 and within arm's length of the GTX 1660. This is a title where you most likely won't see a performance difference between the $170 4GB 5500 XT and the $200 8GB model. There are a couple of titles that I tested though that did show some outlier results, and despite reinstalling the drivers and retesting, Shadow of the Tomb Raider persisted with some slightly lower performance than the RX 590, in fact a little worse overall to the RX 580. So obviously some driver optimizations need to be done here, otherwise it could just be my test bench. We saw a similar thing with the RX 5700 series launch too. Similar thing in World War Z, again performance isn't necessarily bad, but it's just not in line with everything else as we would expect. I did notice some periodic frame time spikes in this title too while playing on the 5500 XT, so good chances are this is a driver issue. So although performance on average is slightly above the RX 590, power consumption is much lower thanks to the 7nm architecture. It's more comparable to the lower performing RX 570. Still though, Navi's performance per watt is a bit worse than what Nvidia have to offer here. The much faster 1660 Super pulls almost the same amount of power. Alright, now the chart that we've all been waiting for, the average value directly compared for each GPU. So here we're looking at the amount of money spent per FPS, so the lower value and the higher ranked each card is on this list, the better value it offers. I will note that this is while including those last two games with the driver issues for the lower 5500 XT performance, but still we have it towards the top of the stack in terms of value. For most of you, I would actually advise the much better value 4GB model, unless you're playing with ultra textures in demanding games like Shadow of the Tomb Raider and Far Cry 5. Also, there's no point in buying the RX 580 or 590 now, given the 5500 XT's release, unless you can get them for a ridiculous price, but the RX 570 for $129 and sometimes $119 is somewhat in its own price bracket and still deserves a recommendation for those on a really tight budget. I've yet to test the GTX 1650 Super against the 5500 XT, but given what I've seen online, expect performance to be pretty much neck and neck between these two GPUs. Overall, a really solid card from AMD, and I think most people should probably go for the 4GB model due to the better value there, and because most people probably don't use 8GB of video memory and probably play more mainstream titles. If you were expecting some overwhelmingly excellent value like we saw with the 5700 and 5700 XT, that's not really what we have here. Instead, the hype has sort of been dampened by the severe price cuts of the RX 500 series, which I don't know how those cards are still available on the market today, but they are. And also, of course, the release of the GTX Super series from Nvidia. So really, you've got a ton of great options now when it comes to choosing a budget GPU, and that's how the market should be, with plenty of competition. So at the absolute bottom end of the price stack, the $129 RX 570 is what I'd personally go for. At $169, I'd bet either the 4GB RX 5500 XT or GTX 1650 Super would be a great choice. And beyond that, I would jump straight to the $229 GTX 1660 Super. So as always, a huge thanks for watching. Consider subscribing down below if you haven't already, and I'll see you all in the next one.